I think one of the things that has happened to the first generation of kids to grow up always being online, which by the way are my kids. They have never experienced dial-up or anything like that. They've always had always on.
Yeah, I think it's going to be pretty amazing to see how the next generation I guess evolves, if you want to call it that, because of their access to technology, but ultimately their access to information.
You can actually bring most of what's been so important and, in fact, epical about the internet down to the simple hyperlink. And you can think of a hyperlink as being a new type of punctuation. The old types of punctuation tells you where to stop. Hyperlink encourages you, beckons you to continue. It makes it so easy to continue to the next thing. You have to do the most minimal human action, which is go like this with your finger. I mean, you really couldn't get any less than that. And you are off into the next page, the next world, the next person. We haven't had anything like that before.
Now that children are brought up with the internet, with its ability to lure them away from traditional media, such as books and newspapers, an important question arises. What does always being online do to children's capacity to take in information and develop themselves in general? Does the internet actually ruin our children, or does it enrich a new generation? The first step in answering that question is finding out what changes the web bring to the information-seeking behavior of Generation Web, as they are called.
When you grow up expecting to be able to find information at a moment's notice, what does it do to your ability to internalize information? And the brain is very, very plastic, very malleable, but at a certain point, it does get wired up, and it gets wired up in a particular way. And so I look at my son, who's 8, and he asked me, my wife, when Michael Jackson passed away, my wife muttered something at the breakfast table about him being a criminal. And my son later asked me, right, was that true? And I said, well, the dilemma of explaining the difference between accusation and proof and so forth, we're going along in this conversation, and I say essentially no one knows, right? There were these questions, nothing was ever proved. And he looked at me and said, not even Wikipedia? And I realized he'd never asked a question before, because he tends to be in the domain of facts. What's the fastest train, Dad? I have no idea, but Wikipedia does. What's the tallest building? I'll just look it up on Wikipedia. And suddenly he comes up to a question that's entirely interpretive. And clearly his worldview was a little bit shaken, because there'd never been a question he couldn't answer before. And so you wonder how much of his relationship to the factual is being shaped by the idea that you don't need to guess or estimate or remember. If you can get your hands on a keyboard, you can find out right then.
Having easy access to so much information, easy, quick access to so much information is we sacrifice some of the depth of our engagement with that information. So the kind of jumping, hopping from bit to bit to bit, clicking on links, takes the place of what used to be a more contemplative, I think, approach to thinking about one thing, whether it's one piece of information or the argument or the narrative of a book. It becomes much harder, I think, when you're bombarded by information and other stimuli, as you are all the time on the web, to sit down and really focus on one particular thing. And so we gain kind of a breadth of engagement with information, but the cost is, I think, a certain superficiality in our relationship to that information.
This is no longer a generation that lives deliberately, that lives its life, that lives in the moment. I think that has time for reflection.
What reading did for us, in particular book reading, is it slowed us down. It took us away from our natural distractedness and forced us to focus on one thing, on a book, on a line of argument, on a line of text, linearly, often for hundreds of pages and hours on end. And that's a very different type of thinking that we're kind of naturally used to. So the book promoted a kind of in-depth engagement with ideas, a kind of very deep thinking, concentrated thinking, contemplative, introspective thinking, which in many ways is kind of a unique aspect of that particular medium, the print on page medium that we never saw before, at least not broadly, until the book became popular 500, 600 years ago.
That the accessibility of information provided by the web changes the way children think and interact with information is now clear. Since that has been established, it is time to look deeper into the effects. The next question that comes up is whether this shift is potentially problematic.
Where people make their fundamental error who criticize all this and think it's a danger and that it's reducing our capacity to act as proper human beings, is they think it's all this. You either sit in front of a screen of some kind, or tapping away all your life, going lol, and being childish and not writing in proper English sentences, or you sit in an old-fashioned study with books and you read properly and you engage properly and you go for walks. Well, I do both. And most people do both. It is not one or the other. Now, you may say, I've had the advantage of a classical education. I've grown up in a tradition in which I've understood books and I've understood history and I've been interested in these things and I like Latin and Greek and and I like the smell of a proper book and so on. That's true, but I have made quite a lot of online friends. I don't even know what gender some of them are. They're people I chat with, either personal or direct messaging in forums and Twitter and so on. Some of whom I think are very young, and you can sort of tell they are, and who astonish me occasionally with their knowledge of literature. In fact, I was having a conversation just the other day with one who was talking to me about Evelyn Waugh. And I think she's 12, and she seems to have read every book that Evelyn Waugh ever wrote and have a very intelligent view of this great novelist. And I almost wanted to say, but how would someone who's 12 like you ever have read these books? And I think, what am I saying? Of course they might have done. And spend a lot of their time on a forum as well. It's not, the two are not mutually exclusive.
I think obviously the brain the human brain is malleable throughout the course of anybody's life, but it's particularly malleable, of course, when you're young. So if a person is brought up looking at screens and using the web and being bombarded by information, then the question is, will the brain circuitry necessary to do things like deep reading, deep thinking, will those circuits ever even come into being? Will they be wired for that kind of thinking, or will they be wired completely for internet type of thinking, for taking in lots of information very, very quickly? And I think that's the big fear, is that we'll end up with a generation of people who are very good at using the net and very good at finding information and processing information very quickly, but don't really have any capacity for contemplativeness or for concentration or for deep engagement with information.
There are now people in their mid to getting on to advanced teens who have never known, obviously, a world without the web. In fact, there may be 20-year-olds who've never known anything about that. Have they developed strange thumbs? Do they have peculiar ways of talking and listening? Do their eyes glaze over when they have to concentrate for more than 30 seconds? No, I don't believe any of that. I'm not particularly negative or pessimistic about the social qualities, the linguistic qualities, the concentration qualities of Generation Web, as they're called. I honestly believe that if you were to go back into the 1920s and take an ordinary, semi-educated 15-year-old and place him next to an ordinary, semi-educated 15-year-old now, you would find the one now knows more, understands more, is more socially confident, is more aware of the rest of the world, is more able and more adept at research, may not be able to say their 9 times table as fluently or repeat amoa mathemata samatis amant. They may not be able to do that. Is that such a great loss to an old-fashioned person like me? I'd love to think people could do both.
I think the great value of thinking deeply and reading deeply and concentrating in general is that we begin to develop a unique personality, a unique intellect that's ours and ours alone. And that requires, I think, deep thought and in the ability to make our own associations and our own connections about things we understand deeply inside our own mind, rather than relying on the associations and connections that might be out in the world and that we might access through hyperlinks, for instance. So I really think that the human self and the human personality becomes much richer when we can slow down and when we can think deeply and engage with information in more than just kind of a cursory manner.
I think education is being redefined. It's not necessarily about memorization. It's about finding, searching for answers. You have an infinite amount of resources available to you, or information available to you. And I think people, or this next generation, I guess are much more knowledgeable about any topic that you can think of.
I think it's at a very deep level in our brain that the more we use the web, the more we train ourselves to skip very, very quickly among many pieces of information, and we lose the ability to stop and concentrate. And so you could say that the outcome of that will have access and ability to process huge amounts of little snippets of information, but we'll kind of begin to sacrifice the ability to create the associations ourselves among those bits of information that I think lead to true knowledge and ultimately wisdom.
Yes, there may be a general shift resulting in less interest surrounding books and other traditional information sources. Shouldn't this simply be seen as progression? Teaching and conversation made place for the possibility to read books and write letters. Progression implies benefits. What are the benefits, and do they stack up against the negatives?
Regardless of whether you think, social technology and the internet is good or bad, it is. This is what, the genie is out of the bottle. And I think that's an amazing thing. The social web can do more good in the world than it can do bad. And it's the choice of people and the people who are using it as to what they want to do with it. It is the most empowering generational shift that has ever happened.
What examples do you have of how hyperlinked thought, this notion of almost a stream of consciousness, going from one idea to the next idea to the next idea. What examples do you have of how this has been good for us and how this is different from a more linear way of thinking from the 19th century?
One of the differences that we have with this kind of hyperlinked thought is that we have a way to dream while we're awake. If you think about the kind of sequence of web pages that you have in the morning when you're skipping along, it's almost like a dream. There's kind of a weird association. You go from a guy in front of a chalkboard to a lady in a veil giving a confession to a boy in a balloon, and it's sort of almost non-irrational. But that dreaming, that playfulness, is, I think, the aspect that we're recovering back into the culture. It's become, in general, very efficient and extremely optimized and productive. And I think one of the things that's beautiful about the web is that it wastes time. And that we can bring that kind of playfulness back into that kind of hyperlinked, let's see where it goes and I'll wander and get lost. And I think that's beautiful.
Does it mean that people have shorter attention spans? Yes. But is that a bad thing? Maybe, depending on what your point of view is. But in terms of what it can actually enable socially, economically, and politically, I think that we should embrace and welcome social technology, not fear it.
I love this idea of playfulness. Yet I think that word, just even the fact that it says the word play in it, would put some people off. This idea that it's not a serious endeavor, that it's not productive. How would you counter that argument?
I don't think I would even counter the argument that playfulness is a wrong attribute to assign to the web, because the web is so much bigger than just business, and making money, and governing. It is really culture at large. It's a new form of culture, and the culture will range from playfulness and inefficiency and just playing around to the most serious accomplishments and achievements of humanity. So it has the full range, and I think we should embrace that, the fact that it can be trivial, that the web can be a waste of time, that it can be nonsense, and at the same time, it's probably the greatest thing that we've ever done.
We're talking about social change and political change and economic change in a way that was never possible before. And I think that that's something that we should embrace, and that we should look at what are the ways that we're going to make it the best of what people can be, as opposed to the worst of what people can be.
It is gathering everything. I mean, one of the things that's really that we don't appreciate right now is the fact that the web is gathering everything. All people, all computers, all documents. And when you have everything, that's a qualitative difference. So it's like the difference between having a few, or knowing a few of the chemical elements, and then knowing all the elements. When you know all the elements, you can do chemistry. It's like seeing only a few of the stars versus all the stars. It's like having only a couple of the letters of the alphabet and having all of them. When you have all, it changes everything. And that's what we're really doing with the web, is that the serendipity comes from having all things on it.
Is this generation, are they going to be all right? Are the kids going to be doing okay? Or should we...
Kids are all right. The kids are all right. No, I absolutely believe that the possibilities and the opportunities for people to live a rich, passionate life that allows them to express themselves in all the ways that they want to, regardless of where they live geographically. I don't think it gets any better than that.